Start in about a minute. Please put your computers and phones away and whatever you're doing, please. We're going to start in a minute. Could somebody please close that back door? Yeah, thank you. Okay, there's a sign-up sheet going around, so please make sure you sign in today. It's right there right now. Okay, I am very excited to start. We obviously have a lot of speakers. I'm especially excited about today's speaker. I'm not going to do his long introduction because he's done so many amazing things. But Dean Richard Lyons was the Dean of the Haas School of Business for 10 years. And then there was a worldwide search for the University of California, Berkeley's first Chief Innovation Officer. And after that big search, Dean Lyons was appointed that position. You know what? I'll just let him get to it right away. Go ahead, please. Dean Lyons, join us. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we will make this very interactive between us, and we'd like to make it as interactive as possible, you know, across our boundary as well. So I thought I would just say a few things up front, and then we can have a discussion, and if you have questions, just break in. So I was an undergrad at Berkeley, and studied business, got very excited about economics. I come from a businessy family, not an academic family, but Berkeley just so turned me on to economics. My PhD, I went on and got a PhD in economics and became an academic, never expecting when I was young that I would do that. I mention that just because, you know, for all of us, and this is true throughout our lives, not just at your stage of life, but the phrase, you can't be what you can't see, it's just so true. You know, for each of us, there are futures that are going to be available to us, but you can't even really imagine them now. If anybody had suggested that I might be able to pursue some of the paths that I did get to pursue, you know, you can't see them. Neither of my parents had a 4-year degree, so when a faculty member came to me and said, have you ever thought about getting a PhD in economics? This was a Berkeley faculty member. It's like, I'm not sure I knew anybody who had a PhD. This was not a path that I could see. So as you're sitting here in this wonderful program and thinking about where's it going to take me, you're still undervaluing the options that you're going to have and the pathways that are going to become available. I just wanted to start with that idea. And then one other quick idea. I got to go to industry. I was the chief learning officer for Goldman Sachs in New York for a couple of years. Actually, I came back from that job to be dean here at Berkeley, but it gave me a chance to be in industry. I've been an academic virtually my whole adult life. But seeing industry from a senior level was really a helpful thing, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit about that. Last comment before we start is my favorite question, whether at a cocktail party or just mixing with colleagues and friends or whatever it is this: what's the best advice you ever got? And if not the best, something that's in your top 5. When you ask people that question, if you give them a few seconds to answer, everybody's got a story to tell. Everybody's got a piece of advice, and so that came at just the right time for me. And you don't have to suggest that the piece of advice that was so important for you would be important for everybody, but all of us, and I imagine your mind is circling on that as well. So, you know, part of my answers to some of these questions will be, you know, one of the top 5 pieces of advice I ever got relates to this question. I'll give you one before we start. I was dean, I was new dean, I'm in my mid-40s, and one of the board members for the Haas School, for the business school, who had run many businesses, very senior person. Her name is Margot Alexander. She said to me, it wasn't actually at the big board meeting, so she said it to me individually, but she said, yeah, you're our dean now, but don't forget, you're also the chief purpose officer. Part of your job now is instilling a larger sense of purpose in the people around you. Because a number of the people who work with and for you, some of them spend half their time every day processing travel reimbursements, for example. They don't get to see inside the classrooms every day the way you do, or talk to the faculty, or see the research, or see the magic. The idea that they work for this remarkable educational institution doesn't mean they're constantly in touch with why this place matters so much. It's your job to keep them in touch with why this place matters so much. Nobody had ever told me that was part of my job, instilling a larger sense of purpose in the people around me. So when you think about what it means to become a leader or an executive or to do the kinds of things that you want to do, for most of you, you probably haven't thought about your life as including that obligation, that responsibility. But as you get more senior in your life and in whatever organizations you choose to be part of, it will become part of your job description. Now that's easier said than done, but it's a really important thing to think about. So a couple of the other best pieces of advice I've ever received will certainly come up, but I just thought I would start with that question and that particular example. Please.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we actually can take questions right there if any of you have any. We have a microphone person.
Yeah, jump in if you have any. You got one? Great.
Well, starting from the fact that I don't even know what a chief innovation officer do.
Good.
Could you explain a little bit more about your job and what would be the first thing you will do as a chief innovation officer?
Thanks. Important question. Thank you for that. You know, the job didn't exist before, so we're sort of defining the job as we go along. I think the way the campus, I don't know if you've seen, so IPERA, our sort of intellectual property and industry relations office. It's some campuses call it the technology licensing office, but IPERA is the acronym that we use here at Berkeley. They have a graphic on their website that is a pentagon, and it's the ecosystem, the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem at Berkeley. It's a really neat graphic. And it's got a lot of points on it. There are like 5 different sectors in the Pentagon, naturally, student-facing and industry-facing and whatever. There are lots of dots on it. But if you rolled back the clock 5 years ago, a third of the dots wouldn't be there. I mean, Berkeley is just a remarkable place in terms of letting 1,000 flowers bloom. A lot of stuff wouldn't have been there, right? So the Skydeck Fund wouldn't have been there. Skydeck would have been brand new, but the Skydeck Fund wouldn't have been there, and many other things. So I'm mentioning this because Berkeley, the ecosystem of innovation and entrepreneurship, and the title also includes the word entrepreneurship, you know, a lot has happened. So the question then is, well, what more needs to happen? Why do you create a job like this? And I was just fine with Randy Katz, who's the Vice Chancellor for Research. He and the Provost and the Chancellor essentially made this job available, but the whole idea was, we're going to try this for 3 years and see whether it works, whether there's really important work to be done. And if not, I think we'll shut it down, and that's fine too. All right, here's the answer to your question. You know, as I think about what some of the, so I will have at least 2 direct reports, people that report directly to me. One will be Caroline Winnett, who is the head of Skydeck, so I will be connected directly to Skydeck. Another will be Carol Mimura, who runs this IPERA, so all the patenting and licensing and all that sort of stuff is going to report through here. A lot of industry, corporate relationships, industry-sponsored research, a lot of that stuff comes up through that office. So that's just kind of a technical answer, who reports to you. But let me share with you, when you start thinking about, all right, I don't start, as was mentioned, I don't start formally until January. I'm teaching this term. But when I've been doing a lot of sort of listening tour types of meetings with people, and all these fantastic ideas are getting generated. So let me just pitch one to you, one example. I don't know whether this will happen or not. But when we start thinking about, all right, there are a million tactical things you could do as the Chief Innovation and Entrepreneurship Officer. But at the end of the day, it's sort of like, look, I hope there are 3 or whatever the number, big things that I can go after over the next 3 years and hopefully get done. And these are things that wouldn't have got done if this job weren't created. I mean, that's kind of the way I think about it. That's what's going to make me feel fulfilled. So here's one example. This is like not even half-baked. Okay, so I'm sharing something with you that I've shared with certain faculty just to say, does this sound reasonable? All right, so the way I'm going to pitch this idea to you is I'm going to pitch it to you like it's a pitch, okay? So one of the things that as Dean of Engineering or Dean of the business school, one of the things we do a lot of is fundraising. So we talk to donors all the time. And there's something called the Giving Pledge. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Giving Pledge, but the Giving Pledge is something you can sign. So Bill Gates has signed it, and anyways, lots of people like that have signed it. It basically says I'm going to give away most of my wealth in my lifetime. So somebody who has $4 billion to give away, a lot of the people that have signed it have more than $4 billion to give away. That's 40 $100 million gifts. We would like to help somebody like that. So imagine I'm having a conversation with somebody who could give Berkeley, whether an alum or not, a $100 million gift. Sounds crazy? There are a lot of people out there that could do that, but it better be a big idea. So here's sort of the pitch. All right, in my new role, what I'm most excited about, I'm going to use a phrase my kids use all the time. We're going to create a thing. We're going to create a curriculum thing. This curriculum is going to be identity making, identity extending for Berkeley. It's going to get attention in higher education across the country, but let's leave other universities out of it. Let's just focus on Berkeley. So, provisionally, we're calling this curriculum, this campus-spanning curriculum, the Change Maker curriculum. So imagine I'm talking to an undergraduate humanist, classics, whatever the major. And the idea is we have this suite of new classes, some of them, learning by doing type classes, some of them classroom type classes. One of them is called the Art of Agency. Do you want your life to have purchase on the world? This is a course and a curriculum that's designed to help you do that. We presume that that's part of why you chose Berkeley, because in fact, this has always been Berkeley's persona among the world's great universities. There's another class that's called Becoming a Changemaker, and the first reading on the syllabus is Mario Savio as an entrepreneur. Look, this is what Berkeley's always been about. We know what happened, Data 8 is an undergraduate class that has essentially spanned the whole campus. It's a remarkable data science class. But is it identity making? So when you think about what this could look like, could you imagine a school, not with its own faculty, not competing with other faculties? The design school at Stanford does not have its own faculty, but is connected widely to all of Stanford and is part of Stanford's identity. What if this $100 million gift created the Changemaker School, the C School at Berkeley? What if you're liking the sound of this and you forget that I'm the one who's pitching this to you? And you think, which university is singularly, in the US, singularly positioned to go after this? A lot of people, whether alums of Berkeley or not, would say Berkeley is the place where the Changemaker curriculum should happen. Now, a humanist hears Changemaker differently than an engineer or a business student. An engineer or a business student hears that as entrepreneurship, and that's great. But if you force entrepreneurship as a concept down the throat of the humanist, you will not be embracing the whole university. So it spans entrepreneurship, but is bigger than that. Last comment. I'm still in pitch mode. Last comment. People keep asking me in my new job, Chief Innovation and Entrepreneurship Officer, how are we going to beat Stanford? It's just kind of a natural question for people to ask me. And I think there's only one good answer to that question. You change the game. Here's the thought experiment. There are two things universities can be known for: entrepreneurship, change making. There are two universities, Stanford and Berkeley. You can be known for one or the other. Not just known for, but really deliver on. Berkeley gets to choose first. Which would it choose? Berkeley would choose change making. Partly because it nests entrepreneurship and is larger than entrepreneurship, and partly because it's what Berkeley's always been about. So let's do this. Now, when people thought about this job description, nobody was thinking about, and I'm out of my pitch now. When people were talking about this job, nobody was thinking about curriculum, right? They were thinking about which accelerator should be launched, which venture fund should be launched. That's why a job like this is fun for me. When you can paint a picture of the future. I'm not saying this is definitely a success. I'm not saying this will happen. But what makes it fun to be in a leadership role like this is with input and ideas that I've been gathering from a lot of other people. If you can paint a picture of the future that people can see and say, not sure how we're going to get there, but let's try. Because it would be great to be there. That's what makes leadership fun. So we're still defining it is the quick answer, but I think there's some really big ideas we could go after. And that's, I hope, will end up being one of them.
If I had 100 million, I would give it to you.
All right,
Yeah.
I'll take it. We'll do it.
sold.
We'll do it.
Okay. I had a lot of questions, but I think that they're a lot less relevant now about your history and background, after that. So, maybe I'll just change course entirely. Maybe you can define for us, what do you mean by change making?
Yeah.
To the person that is not
Thanks.
totally fluent with that, if you had to explain
Yeah.
to students that wanted to be involved in that, what would that mean?
So look, I love the question, and we have to define it sharply. I think I use that sort of rhetorical question. You're a humanist. Do you want your life to have purchase on the world? So the word that works really well for me, I don't think it works for everybody, is agency. People want to feel like their life matters, like they've had an impact on something. And when you don't feel like you're having impact, people get depressed. They don't feel fulfilled. It's really a fundamental human need. So what is it that at a university, how do we help people have a life of agency? But let them define what agency looks, right? You can imagine a lot of humanists on campus, when they see the word change maker, they think activism, they think social change, they think civic organizations, they think mobilizing for climate change, which is fine, right? But it's sort of like, have some agency in your life, please. We need you to want to have and to pursue agency in your life, and that's what Berkeley's about. So I think, when you think about what topics does change making go after, I'm a business school dean, right? So I think entrepreneurship, I think commercial, I think companies, they're changing the world very, very rapidly, right? But there are just a lot of people elsewhere on campus, which is great, that don't naturally go there. But there's room in the concept. It's capacious enough for people to say, if the theme, if the red thread through all of this is agency, for want of a better word, it's like Berkeley is about that and always has been about that.
Okay. We had a question in the back.
Please.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, to add on top of your question, how do you measure change making?
Super important question. One of the topics that I think we'll get to, a big project that we worked on at the Haas School was defining a set of values. We call them defining principles or defining leader principles that gave the Haas School identity. And I'm an economist. I'm actually geared to think that behavior comes from incentives, rewards, decision rights, contracts, agency relationship. It doesn't come from squishy stuff like behavioral norms and values, culture. So we went after this big culture effort at the Haas School, spent over a decade on it. But one of the vision statements that we had, I will answer your question, but I just want to, these are good questions and hard questions, but they're answerable questions. And so people said, well, we're putting all this time into defining a culture for the Haas School. We ended up with 4 of these defining principles that we knew many of our competitors would not be willing to write down several of these principles. So in other words, they were differentiating. When you can write something down that's true, or at least aspirationally true, and is valuable and is different, your competitors wouldn't write it down, now you're talking separation. And we wrote down 4 things. Question the status quo, confidence without attitude, Students always, beyond yourself, sense of stewardship for something larger. Officers eat last, that kind of stuff. So then the vision statement was, we want to be understood externally and internally, but especially externally, as the most defined by culture, hyphens, the most defined by culture business school. And the main industry rag, called Poets and Quants, it's a blog site, published an article written by their journalist, not by anybody at Haas. And in the first sentence or two, it described the Haas School as the archetype of the values-centered MBA program. So, it is hard to measure delta in a lot of these sorts of situations. But to answer your question more specifically, for a business student or an engineering student, engineering or entrepreneurship is a pretty narrow way to measure it, but we can put all kinds of gauges on entrepreneurship. How many got above this level of funding in a year, right? A very natural thing. How many of them got this big over what time period? So there are lots of ways of thinking it. But you could also go even further upstream in the funnel, right? It's sort of like how many of your MEng projects, became Skydeck, hot desk companies or what have you, right? There are just a lot of ways to think about that funnel. Then, for people on campus, I think, you could actually put it to a student. It's like, all right, you heard this course name, The Art of Agency, and they said, do you want your life to have purchase on the world? Now you define what a high purchase life for you looks like. But let's actually define it in a measurable way. And I think part of the beauty in this is that people would define it very differently. For me, I'm an idea person. I just get off on ideas. Not everybody does, most academics do. But if you ask me, well, how do you define purchase in your life? What are the things that have happened in your life that make you feel like you've had the most agency you've ever had? What are the hot spots in terms of agency in your life? I'm 58, in your 58 years. Is it when you were making the most money? Absolutely not. It's when, and I could answer the question directly, but I think all of us have an answer to that. All of you. If you said, when was the time in your life when you felt like you had the most agency, the most sort of impact on things that matter? And why do you feel it was that way? And how do you build more of that into your life? So the question's a great one, but I think even things like show me that culture actually moved the dial. Show me the data. In fact, the MBAs, when we asked them, why did you choose this school? A bunch said reputation. A bunch said because I want to be in Silicon Valley. And 3 times as many said culture-defining principles. They're choosing the school because of it. So, great question. How do we measure these things? But we can come up with some pretty creative ways to put gauges on it. But I think we're going to need to be flexible with a word like change maker. Yeah. Please.
I'm also pretty loud.
We have people that are listening on a webcast.
We're doing a video, so we need,
So, hi. Okay,
Hey.
hi. My name is Daniel Campo.
Thanks, Daniel.
So I have a weird question. So give me a moment to try to be clear. So you've kind of touched on this topic multiple times as you've been discussing this, but what you've been telling us, the vision that you're talking about with this change maker curriculum is really incredible, but it also seems kind of ambiguous, and it seems like you have formulated your own way of what that might look like. But it's clear that everybody might have a different viewpoint. So my question here would be, when you're dealing with these kind of ambiguous, lofty, but very valuable goals, how do you keep your own bias from kind of shaping it into something that might not be ideal?
Yeah, well, that's an important question. There's a field and a toolkit for leaders called change management. So we've all heard that phrase, but it's like a toolkit. Like you can read books on how do you manage change, what levers do you work, what is the toolkit. And one of the things that's really important, because this is a change management task, right? I mean, if we actually thought about this being shot through in some universal way, the Berkeley curriculum, it's like that's a huge deal. And that's something the faculty decide, not administrators, right? That's absolutely not something I could even choose. No administrator could. That is the domain of the faculty, rightfully. So there's a lot of, people have to want to get behind this. I think the right answer though is, and this is part of why I mentioned change management, people want to feel like they've, not just been consulted, but that they've helped shape what this looks like. So when I was talking to, I won't mention too many names because I don't want to, on camera attribute ideas to specific people, but I was talking to senior people in letters and science, in humanities. And they were saying, for a lot of humanists graduating on campus, unlike I think in engineering, definitely unlike in business, their oral presentation skills, being able to stand up in front of a group and command their attention and pitch, not just pitch isn't the right word, just influence people orally and have the confidence to do so. Really important for having agency in life. Now, it might just be a team or a group of people, but it's like, boy, you got to get good at that. And there is a skill set, and we have classes that we teach on this. And her first reaction to Changemaker was, I want all of the humanists graduating on campus to have that skill set when they graduate. And way too few have it now. And I thought, great, not the first thing I thought about. In part because our curriculum already has a ton of that, but it has a ton of that for a reason. It's sort of like, so I think the right answer is, let them design. Once you get anywhere close to the ground, anywhere close to classes and curriculum and things like that, I say, the art of agency. It's like, they might reject that very quickly, right? But I was talking to the dean of education, and we were talking about becoming a change maker in education. All I said was, imagine a course with that title. Could you and your faculty design real content for that course? No problem. And you could take that title and push it into any dean or any chair of a department, and they'd say, I could design a course for that. It's like, you design it. That's not for me to design. So you're quite right. You want people to feel like they have shaped the reality on the ground. And then you're not feeling resistance to change. You're feeling, momentum, wind in the sail, not in your face. Yeah.
I'm gonna quickly actually jump in. There's two things that I think that would be good for the class to read after this class, one of which I'll send to you. One is the case that is written about the principles that Rich came up with and disseminated throughout Haas. And that case goes into a lot of detail about, he wanted to leave a lasting legacy as his time at Haas was winding down. He wanted to impart a set of principles so that Haas would be able to carry on without him. There's a very good book, it's a very seminal business book called From Good to Great by Jim Collins that talks about different type of leadership styles. And the kind of highest echelon of leadership is something they describe as level 5 leadership that has certain qualities to CEOs that they've done regressions on or leaders over the long term. And among those qualities that they describe, the way to become actually a level 5 leader is to leave a lasting legacy, that you prepare for your own departure, that an organization will be set to function as well without you as it did with you, which is definitely something that the case really, really exemplifies. The second part of that is about humility and allowing exactly what Rich just said, allowing the people below you to make decisions and execute, if you set a vision, to exactly do that, to let an organization achieve the goals that it has by allowing people to do their jobs effectively. In the case, if you read it and then read, there's also a shorter article by Jim Collins called Level 5 Leadership that you can kind of correlate and see how all those skills are really exemplified in Rich's leadership at Haas. It's very interesting.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a great book. I remember reading it years ago, and it, that mix of drive, because they lots of research went into this, and they said these two defining qualities of these great leaders. One of them, humility, is the word they use, and the other, drive. Effectively, they may have used a slightly different word for it, but I think of it as humility and drive. But when we wrote down at the Haas School confidence without attitude, i.e. confidence without arrogance, it would be ridiculous for any business school to stand up and say, the only way you can succeed in business or elsewhere is to not be arrogant. That is just patently false. There are a lot of terrifically successful business people and people in life that you would never describe as not arrogant, i.e. they are patently arrogant or with attitude. And so the idea is not that this is the way you must be, but the idea is, we're going we're going to take a stand on something. And, part of it is a challenge. Those other top business school deans, are you willing to stand up and say something like confidence without attitude, or whatever you want to say that sounds like that? In other words, imagine we've got 300 people in this room, which is the size of the incoming MBA class at Haas. You're brand new, you've just been admitted, you haven't even decided yet whether you're going to come. Half of you have decided, half of you haven't. We have an event that's just like that. Those who haven't decided, there are 2 or 3 other schools you've got into, and you're trying to decide whether to come or not. So here's one of the things when I was still dean that I would say to that group. Now, they'd got through the admissions process. They had seen confidence without attitude in those 4 defining principles. They are shot through the admissions process. Here's one of the things I said to them. If you're meeting the people next to you, look, these are impressive people. We know that. I'm sure you're excited to be meeting them. But if you're meeting somebody and you're thinking, wow, she's impressive, but how did she get through the confidence without attitude interview? And then they sort of titter. But I said 2 things. 1, let me know. And 2, you might not want to come here because it means I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. That's the moment where you throw the gauntlet down. If 6 people out of 300, if 2% were obvious violations of confidence without attitude, and we can all find people who are obvious, patent violations of confidence without attitude, the students would be like, wah, 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 right? Oh, well, come on, that's a donor's daughter. What did you think I was going to do? That's an alumni son. That person, et cetera. It's like, no, if you're going to put it on the masthead and tell people you mean it, you'd better walk the walk, because people can tell instantly if you're not walking the walk. So part of this is not just putting shiny words on the wall. It's being willing to say, if you see violations, don't come. We mean it. And private schools that depend on philanthropy and are willing to make admissions decisions based on philanthropy can't play this strategy. Cannot. If 10, 15, 20%, whatever of your class is being admitted for other reasons, then people would always listen to what you say and say, wah, wah, wah. So part of why Berkeley is what it is because we don't do admissions that way, and it allows us to play a pure, straight strategy. But you have to play the strategy. When I first became dean, I went on the website of the Haas School, and I searched for core values, principles, culture. 2008, nothing there. Now, does Berkeley have a culture? Does Haas have a culture? Of course it did. Every organization has a culture. But were we being intentional about it? Were we calling it out? Were we telling people, don't come if you see that we violated it? I mean, stand for something, please. There's so much clutter out there. It's like, take a stand. That's what people want to see from their leaders. Take a stand that's hard. Take a stand that means you're putting a 790 GMAT and saying no, right? It's easy to do stuff that's easy. People want to see you do something hard, and then they'll be behind you.
I have questions. I guess I would ask, how would you then, set those values in motion? How would you control for that, right? How can you tell confidence without attitude, right? If you're going to make this transformation of the entire business school,
yeah,
right? And you have this vision.
Great question.
I mean, that's a great goal, but how do you put that into a concrete plan?
Great question. So, when I think of kind of a culture effort, the articulation, I remember I mentioned I went to the website, there was nothing there, right? So we had to figure out, well, what are you going to write down? So that's like the content of the culture, if you will, and those were those 4 principles that we wrote down. But that's like 20% of the, right? 80% is what we call execution, right? It's like, how do you change? If you just write them down and put them on the website, you change nothing. You actually just wasted an opportunity. How are you going to drive it through what you do in a way that has some traction? Because otherwise you really are wasting everybody's time. So how did we, in the admissions process, get to a point where we could stand up and say, if you see violations, don't come? Well, you'd better have an admissions process that is looking for violations, or you're going to end up having a lot of people not come because You got to be actually walking the walk, doing the do, as they say. All right, so the quick answer to your question is this. So I'm an academic. I'm not naturally operations oriented, but if you took an operations class, whether it's operations research in engineering or an operations class in the business school, you could think about all of the business processes of any enterprise, a business school, an engineering department, a company, whatever. Business process. How do you hire people? How do you advertise for jobs? How do you interview for jobs? How do you promote people? How do you build your product? All of it, right? Some of them have to do with production. Some of them have to do with people and hiring. Some, your marketing. What does your website look like? They're literally hundreds and hundreds of business processes that regularize what you do, make it more routine. You just have to do that or you can't function. So if we just took admissions now, so we looked at the whole, think about, kind of a square, a map with hundreds, just write out every business process that the hospital engages in. We did this. And it has to do with staff and faculty and students and alumni and the advisory board and all of it. And then ask, looking at each of those little atoms in that space and asking, could we change that business process to drive this deeper into what we do? Could we change that business process? Now, I'm going to just shine a light on one partition, admissions. It's just one partition in this larger space. And then you look at admissions, you say, we have 6 degree programs. Okay, an even sharper light, admissions in full-time MBA. Well, that's not one business process. It's like 15. We interview every single person that we admit. What does the interview assessment form look like? The people doing the interview are often alums. How do we train the viewers to ask the right questions? Letter writers. What questions do we ask the letter writers? We changed the questions we asked the letter writers. One of them that got changed was, in the leaders we develop at Berkeley Haas, we value very highly confidence without attitude. And for internationals, we said sort of confidence without arrogance, e.g. confidence without arrogance. Does this person have that? Give us some concrete examples. We changed the website, we changed the information sessions, we changed boom, 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 boom. Changed like 12 different processes just in full-time MBA admissions so that you can get to the end. Now, you will never have a perfect system, but, if we really did something like confidence without attitude, now Berkeley doesn't get this exactly right, but please understand, we're a public university business school. We compete with, the most prestigious private university business schools. And Berkeley on average has done better on this count. So we were codifying something we already were known for. Confidence without attitude is not what recruiters were saying about Berkeley. In fact, we got that phrase from a recruiter who said, you know why I hire here? I hire your students because they have confidence without attitude. We wrote it down and we ran with it. So I think if you really are systematic about the business processes that drive real decisions, like who's getting in and who's getting promoted and all that kind of, what's getting taught in the classrooms, that's what you have to do, and you'll never do it perfectly. But if you just come up with the words and then you say yay, it's like, oh my, that's worthless. Maybe less than worthless.
Yeah, great. Questions, please.
So I think that was a really valuable, about how you do it internally. But
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any advice for how to evaluate it externally. So say when you're looking at a company that has some 4 set of values, how do you go about evaluating whether you think that they actually mean it?
Yeah, that's a super, super question. There's an article that I will send you. If you're interested, you can just reach out to me or one of the leads of the session here. It was written by a columnist. Her name is Lucy Kellaway. She wrote for the Financial Times for many years. And she wrote an article, it was a few years ago now, but she basically said, I had 25 CEOs coming to a conference in London. And I played a little trick on them. This is in her column. She says, I went to the websites of the 25 firms the day before the conference, and I downloaded the core values on the websites for all those firms. Then the next morning, they were all in the room, and I said, how many of you know the core values of your company? 25 hands go up. Then she said, I'm going to put core values set by set, without the company name, up on the screen, one by one. And when your company's set goes up there, you raise your hand. 5 got it right. And the reason only 5 got it right is they were all using the same words. So her point was not that culture doesn't matter, but if you're going to write down, remember I said, if it's true and it's valuable, in the world of culture, those two things aren't hard. I can come up with a lot of words that are true, or at least aspirationally true, and are valuable. But can I write down something that's different? There are so many top business schools, I guarantee you, the dean would not write down confidence without attitude. It would create too much dissonance in the marketplace, even if they wanted to. That's a good thing to double down on when your competitors can't play the card. So I think, I haven't answered your question yet, but you will see a lot of similarity, sadly, when you look at companies like that. So I think the way to do this would be, first of all, some companies will say, all right, we use the word integrity, but here's very specifically what we mean by it. Integrity would be one of those words that Lucy Kellaway says was on almost everybody's list. It's not a bad word. It's a wonderful word. But if a company says, one level down, boom, here's what we mean by this, right? It's sort of like, oh, okay, so they're clear on this. It's got some signature in it, even if the word integrity doesn't have any signature in it. The way they talk about it does. But listen for that second order signature if it's not in the first order word. A second thing is, just ask the people, how real is this? Does this feel real? Especially for people that have worked in multiple firms in the same industry, right? People that have cross-firm experience, because firms might be using the same words, but can feel pretty differently. So those are some of the things to try to look for, but it is hard. And then I think, a third thing maybe, people talk about kind of the unwritten culture, right? It's not what's on the website. It's sort of like, so I'll share with you. I got to, the most interesting culture project I got to work on before I got back to Berkeley was when I was at Goldman Sachs. And the project was, we were interviewing outside hire managing directors. So an MD, a managing director at a company like that, in that industry, roughly the top 5% of the company. So these are quite senior people. And when you hire somebody from the outside at that senior a level, it's like, you don't want to make mistakes. It's expensive. You have 25 interviews. You're moving somebody from a different city, whatever. It's really, so their technical competence is not in question. They're 25 years of experience somewhere else. But their culture fit is in question. And when you have people that come and then they last for 6 months and they leave because they couldn't acculturate, because the culture felt foreign, it's like, whoa, we have to solve that problem. So we did a lot of ethnographic research, right? We just interviewed a bunch of people who were 3, 6, 9 months into Goldman Sachs. I was in the Human Resources Division, what they called Human Capital Management. As Chief Learning Officer, that was sort of where I lived in the company. And so it was natural for me to do some of this work. We created a document that we presented to the CEO and the management committee, and the document was called The Top 5 Culture Shocks Experienced by an Outside Hire MD. That was fascinating, because we'd meet with these people and just say, what's hard? Nobody says, oh, this business principle on the website was foreign to me, right? No, they're talking about, like, in the office yesterday, somebody did this. It's like at Citibank, people never did that. It just blew me away. And I could give you some examples of what these things look like. But when you talk about that kind of culture shock level, it's like when somebody, if somebody's interviewing, you could say, could you think back to when you came to Deloitte, whatever the company, and what things did you notice that kind of stuck out as wow, this is different than what I'm used to, because those are often telltale signs of what culture really means in terms of behaviors on the ground.
Yeah, great question. I would add that McKinsey had a study done about 10 years ago that showed about 70%, and why I say this is so you understand the importance, I think, of why Richard puts such an emphasis on culture. 70% of organizational transformations end up failing, and of those that fail, 70% of those failures are because of culture problems. It is critical to any type of organizational transformation. There's again, if you're more interested in this, there's a book by a senior partner of McKinsey named Scott Keller, called Beyond Performance, he was a speaker for me last year actually, very dynamic. And the book really explains exactly, again, what Rich has put into practice, which is the difference between organizational health and performance. Mm-hmm. Performance got a more long-term, how does it perform? And health, it's the culture, right, that you have to address before the performance. So that's a very strong book if you're interested in this topic.
If I would just add one point to this because it relates to exactly what you said. So Indiegogo, which is one of the crowdfunding platforms out there, was started at Berkeley. And one of the founders came and gave a talk. So this is like startup culture, right? You think, come on, our job is to ship. Our job is not culture. It's like we don't have the bandwidth to think about culture. But more and more entrepreneurs, right? Whether they're trying to learn from Uber or other companies that have really stumbled on culture. It's like, no, think about culture a little earlier, okay? When your team goes from 10 to 20 people, that could be a huge culture change if there's no intentionality around culture. Anyways, one of the things that they did when they launched Indiegogo, I don't remember at what size they were, but they asked people, what is it that gets you out of bed in the morning wanting to come to work? Why are you excited about being part of this venture? And then they took the words and descriptions that people had and they built a culture around that. They articulated the culture around that. So in other words, it's like, what's the goal of the culture? If the goal of the culture is to make people want to come to work and feel purpose in their work, you could design a culture with that goal in mind. At the end of the day, culture is not just a nice to have. We didn't pick confidence without attitude just because it's kind of, those are the people I want to have dinner with. They might be the people I want to have dinner with. They in fact are. But the point is, we think that's where leadership should go. We're in the human capital shaping business. We think that that's where leadership should go. So this is an important part of what we're trying to do. It's strategically relevant. It's not just nice to have. And so when you start thinking about, all right, my company right now, what are we trying to do? One way to think about articulating culture is to sort of say, what's the goal? And what culture will drive the goal? Then the whole thing kind of lines up in a powerful way, or can, yeah.
So we're going to shift topics. It's interesting, we're working back today. We started at your current position, or your new position, and then your time as dean. Did we have a quick question? I wanted to get to one other thing. Did we have a quick question? Yeah. Nice. Thank you.
Thank you. So you mentioned before how important it is in people's self-satisfaction that they feel like they have agency. And you mentioned that, I'm not sure if it was brought into this role or in Goldman Sachs, that you were it was very important for you to give purpose to your employees.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you do that? How do you give people agency and purpose? Yeah. Even in companies that are massive, and there's some people who, super. It's very difficult for them to feel that
Super
way.
question. And it's one of those things that's easy to say, and sort of like, wait a minute, what would I do here? So I'm gonna share a story with you. I guess I'm on video, so that's okay. But I won't use the name. You might be able to guess the name. But anyways, part of it is, there are things, it was in my dean role specifically, or not, that came up, chief purpose officer. And part of how it was framed to me is that human beings are purpose consumers. We're all purpose consumers from day one. But there's a point in your life where you start becoming a purpose creator, a purpose supplier, right? That chief purpose officer is that transition. And many of us really don't think consciously about that until much later on in life. And the toolkit that seemed most natural for me was storytelling. So I as dean get all these great stories that are sent to me in emails or whatever, stuff like that. It's like, did it make my day? Of course it did. But did I share the story? This would have made everybody at the business school's day. Be the chief storyteller. So I'm about to tell you a story that I told many times. It's on my phone, so I'm going to pull my phone out. So, and it relates to stuff that engineering and business do together. So we launched MET, Management, Entrepreneurship, and Technology, the new dual degree undergrad program. And there were some funders of this program that were absolutely fundamental to getting this program done. And the principal funders are really well-known, super successful people. I won't mention the names, that's not important. when we first launched the program, like put it on the application, it's happening, press release, all that stuff went out. So it's a dual degree undergraduate program at Berkeley. It got a lot of attention. And on Facebook and other social media, young people were posting these messages. It's like, I want to go back to Berkeley and get another degree. I want to do this again. Or this is like perfect. This is like designed for me. And they're just putting on all these gorgeous comments, right? And so what we did, Shankar Sastry, who was the dean here then, and I, and we're close friends, we pulled 10, 15 of these sentences off of the website the day it launched, and we sent them to the donor, to the principal donor. Again, somebody who's just, you know, a remarkably successful human being. And here's what he or she wrote back, right here. This brings tears to my eyes. Thank you both so much for believing. You will both do, talking to me and the Dean of Engineering, you will both do more significant things in your careers because you educate and touch so many people. For me, I won't ever do anything more significant and lasting than this. This is forever. Thank you. I told that story a lot of times. I still get choked up telling it. That's why we do this. That's why it's important. We're doing this together. Now, you can tell that story or you can not tell that story. Tell the damn story, right? People want to feel like it matters, and it does matter. But when you're in a leadership seat, you're hearing all the stories. Tell the stories. But also, use your radar. Is this kind of a purpose-creating story? Does this make people feel good about what we're doing here? And if it does, tell it. It's just so easy to not tell the story. So that's my...
Any other questions? Seeing the smiles around the room. Any questions? Because we're going to... Oh, okay.
Yep.
Hi, my name's Tim Barrett. I have a question regarding Berkeley's culture to IP.
Yep.
And any advice you would share with students that had an idea and they're going to negotiate some kind of licensing, or how do you negotiate that whole environment? What advice would you give?
Yeah, well, that's a big area, and it's one of the areas that I'm thinnest in. So I have to, you know, as I mentioned, I'm going to work closely with Carol Momura, who oversees all of that and will always know more about. I mean, she's been doing it for over a decade. She's very, very strong at it. You know, IP is a complicated area, as you know. In general, when students come to Berkeley and come up with ideas and want to build a company based on those ideas, the IP is theirs as a general principle. The flip side is if we have a scientist that's using a Berkeley lab, a Berkeley faculty member that produces something in a Berkeley lab, the IP is Berkeley's, UC's, it's the University of California's, period, right? And so those are kind of two polar extremes. Now, you can imagine there's a lot of fuzzy stuff in between, right? So one of the things that Berkeley did very recently, because, and it's sort of a pilot program, I just recently learned about it, but you know, you can imagine, we have lots of life science labs. Something gets produced in a life science lab, it's like UC property, period. Lots of companies out there, though, want to do some joint work with Berkeley, but it's sort of like you can't do it if you're going to give away all the IP of anything that gets created if you do it in a lab here at Berkeley. So we've created, with very strict rules, certain usages of Berkeley life science facilities with outside partners that do not involve 100% ownership of the IP to the university. So that's a very special situation. And then the question is, can we define these zones where people can share IP and still use Berkeley facilities? Now, Berkeley has to be very careful about this, right? These are public assets. Those are commercial companies. You know, let's make sure that we're being very careful about this. And we are. So your question was more about students. I think, you know, some students, the IPERA, this IP office, can be very, very helpful in giving you advice about patenting and things like that, and provide you services and that kind of thing. So there's a service bundle that's available there. When you go down that path, usually the university starts participating in some way or another in the IP. As a student, if you said, look, I want to avoid all of that, I'm going to hire an attorney that's outside the system and I'm just going to own all of it, that's another option. So I'm not giving you a sharp answer. I think you can go to IPERA and find out what services they could provide and what kind of IP and licensing commitments you'd be making if you used their services, and then look at the outside option where you don't have that and try and make a call based on that. Unfortunately, it's going to take a lot of judgment. Some people go one way, some people go the other. But for some people, having that kind of connection to the university, even though you're not formally obligated to have it, is pretty valuable. And it would really depend on the idea, I think. Sorry, it's so muddy, but it's a complicated area. Yeah.
Okay, I want to cover
Please.
Rich's time at Goldman Sachs, which is very interesting. So, as Rich mentioned, like I said, we're moving backwards. You know, he was faculty and then became chief learning officer of Goldman Sachs. As we discussed before this, I worked at Goldman Sachs briefly. There is no company that I have ever seen that has a more defined culture than Goldman Sachs.
Yep.
It is just
Totally agree.
rock solid.
Totally agree.
And
not to everybody's taste.
No comment. But I will say that you know, it's more rare to see faculty members go into industry than vice versa. Industry, you know, experts become faculty. So first of all, how did that job kind of come about? You left Berkeley to go to Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
And what was your role there as chief learning officer? And I guess longer term, what was the kind of takeaway after you worked in industry and came back here? Because one of the kind of criticisms of business school has been that a lot of the faculty are pure research oriented, and they simply are repeating cases. And it'd be like a nurse who's never put in an IV teaching classes.
That's all the time we have. Thank you very much for coming out today.
So
that's a great question.
It's one of the long-term
really
criticisms of business school, and you know, and I think there's some validity to it.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And so, having gone into industry and then coming back, you know, what was your takeaway? Did that shape any of your approach to being dean then?
Yeah, thanks. It shaped it a lot. So I was not looking to go into industry, is one thing I should say. So chief learning officer, at least at Goldman Sachs, the focus of it was leadership development. So there's something called Goldman Sachs universities. And so like, how do you train young people, analysts and associates, sort of early career people in certain derivatives and things like that, you know, pure financial stuff, right? So the Goldman Sachs University is like a little university within Goldman Sachs. People don't want to work at a big firm like that unless you're going to educate them in a very practical way. So corporate universities are very real and a very important part of how Goldman gets young people to choose Goldman, right? We've got Goldman Sachs University. We have all these classes. Okay. But it was less that reported through me, but there was also something called Pine Street, and Pine Street was much narrower. It was only for the managing directors, and it was focused on leadership development, and that's part of why they brought me in. Now, I am a finance guy. I'm an economist, and I do finance research. I am not a leadership guru, right? There are people that write books on leadership, and that's not my field. So it was a stretch for them to bring me in. The way it started, I got a call. There was a guy named Scott. You wouldn't know him. His name is not as important. But he had worked at Goldman. This was 2005. And I get a call from Scott. He was helping advise us on our master's in financial engineering program. And he had retired from Goldman at that point. And I had been acting dean for 1 year. And he'd seen me as an acting dean. And he said, why don't you interview for this job, chief learning officer? And it's sort of like, what? Why would I do that? And he, you know, he's saying, I think you'd be really good at it. And I thought, that is just crazy. And I wasn't looking. And he said, just talk to him. So just talk to the headhunter. So I talked to the headhunter, and then I did one interview. Anyways, all of a sudden I'm thinking about this. It's like I could go on leave for a year or two, maybe stay at the end of it. I don't know, but I just see what the heck's going on here. And it was. Look, I didn't know whether I was going to survive. I don't want to make it sound like it was easy. I think in my adult life, I had more confidence in graduate school that I would finish my PhD, which is one of the times when you're least confident, I think, or as an assistant professor that I would get tenure, than that I would succeed at this job after having been there 6 months. It was just like, oh my gosh, am I out of my comfort zone? I was in a totally, you know, for me, pretty foreign environment. At the same time, I have never learned so much so fast. It's just sort of like, wow. It was like, I mean, you've heard the fire hose metaphor before. It was just like, I'm meeting people I've never met before. I'm seeing things. It's just like, this is just fascinating. So I'm so glad that I did it. Anyways, he urged me to look at it. I had a couple of interviews. I started to get excited. I realized I could make it work with my family and went for it. And learned a ton. So let me just give you one example of, at the time, so I mentioned this is 2005. If you had asked me in 2003, whatever, just go back before this period. I'm an economist. I'm geared, as I said, I'm geared to think about incentives, rewards, contracts, decision rights, agency, right? I'm not geared to think about behavioral norms and values. I'm not geared to think about culture. That's what, you know, our management faculty do. That's not what I do as an economist and a finance person. I got to work on that top 5 culture shocks work, which, you know, at what point did the scales fall from my eyes? I'll give you one very concrete example. Here's one of the culture shocks on that list. You're sitting with somebody who's 6 months into Goldman Sachs from Citibank, name your bank. They're having trouble acculturating. It's like, what's hard? Tell us what's hard. Nobody says, boy, that 5th business principle on the website is the one I'm having trouble. No. It's like, here's a behavior that feels totally foreign to me. Tell me, what is it? And somebody will say, you know, I'm getting all these voicemails. I'm getting all these emails. Once a week, somebody slaps my wrist. A peer, another MD, slaps my wrist and says, Rich, I should have known that. And you should have told me that. Now, please understand, banking is rightfully a highly regulated industry. So we are not talking about information from investment banking, a mergers and acquisitions deal, getting into the trading room before it was supposed to. Regulators sit on the trading desk. They will close the bank yesterday when that happens. That's not what I'm talking about. The question is there a behavioral norm that gets senior people, all people really, but especially senior people, to share information with one another? Because it might be useful across business lines or across people. Now, it is human nature to hoard information. You and I could have worked together for 20 years. We really like each other. But there's certain information I get where it's like, this could be pretty useful to me, and I may not share it with you. In most companies, what you have is what I would call a hoarding equilibrium. People play information close to the chest. It's a human thing. It's not. Now, to get to an equilibrium where people share information, you need to be intentional about that behavioral norm. You need to call it out. You need to hit somebody's wrist. And in fact, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but the third time I make this mistake, you come up to me, you don't say, I should have known that. You say, this really isn't working, is it? And somebody might get the hint that they should leave. They haven't been fired, but they're realizing this is not a cultural fit. Now, if you came from a company where it was hoarding all the way, and all of a sudden you get hit with this, you're going to make this mistake multiple times. Now, here's why the scales fell from the eyes. And here's one of my favorite examples. Thought experiment. There are 2 universes, Universe A and Universe B. Universe A is the existing universe. Goldman Sachs doesn't get that one behavioral norm exactly right, but it's very intentional about it. Universe B is exactly the same as Universe A. It's just Goldman does not have this one behavioral norm. It has a hoarding norm, the way every other company does. Question. Is it possible that Goldman Sachs A is worth 5% more than Goldman Sachs B, or 3, or 7, or 12? Anybody that knows banking or professional services firms say, yes, that one behavioral norm could account for percentages of enterprise value. One behavioral norm. Now, if somebody said I could produce that behavioral norm with the right incentive and compensation structure, I'd say, rubbish. There's no way you could. So that's the point where an economist looks at an outcome that really couldn't be reached with my mental model and toolkit as an economist and realized that is a profoundly valuable behavioral norm. It drives the business and the effectiveness of the company. And I got to see it firsthand. And those are the moments, you know, if you had said to me, if I didn't have the Goldman experience, would Haas have ever gone after a culture strategy? I think the answer is no. The culture strategy, a bunch of people worked on it. That wasn't just me. A bunch of people worked on it. But at the end of the day, you become a dean, it's like, what 3, 4, 5 things are the most important ones that I want to work on? Like I mentioned, that change maker thing. I don't know whether that's going to be one of the top three things I work on in my new role, but you're constantly thinking about what are the big needles. The small stuff you have to pay attention to, but if you want to lead and make change happen, it's like, what are the 3 or 4 big things? There's just no way that culture would have been on my radar screen if I hadn't just come through that experience. And so it's sort of like, wow. I mean, call it serendipity, call it what you will, but you're a product of your experience in such a fundamental way.
Questions? I want to keep on asking all the questions if you guys have some. Okay, so, kind of back to the earlier question I think I had, the second half of it, right? So the culture from Goldman Sachs, like we said, is very strong, and it kind of gave you the idea. Do you feel that it, affected the overall academics of Haas at all? Your vision for the academics and kind of what you wanted the students to be, and kind of how you overall saw what they were learning? Because a lot of different business schools kind of have a different vision for that.
Yeah, I think realistically there are only a small set of really big things you can go after, and if you're thinking about the curriculum, so there's the wider curriculum, the co-curriculum, and there's lots of stuff that isn't sort of in the 4-credit curriculum. But the 4-credit curriculum is owned by the faculty, like period, and that's the right thing. So you come in as a dean and you have to kind of ask, all right, I only have so much fuel, I only have so much powder. Where am I going to put my energies? And curriculum evolution is not where I put my energies. It doesn't mean that I didn't see things that I couldn't learn from, and I would offer, obviously, comments. The one thing that I did feel was important was, if you thought about, putting new ideas into action. Let me define innovation as putting new ideas or new combinations of old ideas into action. One sentence. I did come in, having been at Goldman, thinking we need to get innovation drilled deeper into our faculty, faculty slot selection. We launched a company, well, engineering's gone even further than Haas did, but we launched a design thinking course and put it in the core. It's like, no, we're going to make everybody take this course. We called it problem finding, problem solving, PFPS. But we put it in the core, which is a big deal. That was the only sort of big curriculum thing that I said, I think we really need to do that. That wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been there. All of that said, the water was carried by other people. That course was designed by other people and so forth. So I think if people look back on my deanship, they'd say he was pretty light touch on the curriculum. And that's, again, just kind of a prioritization for me.
Okay. Yes.
First of all, thank you for being here.
Sure.
I'm David Tondro. At the beginning of just that sentence you had there, you said there's only a small amount of big things that you can make happen.
Yeah.
For us in the MEng program, we're only here for 9 months.
Yeah.
So that's even more imperative for us, or equally as imperative. And there's a ton of things going on here at Berkeley, from classes to our capstone project that we have to do for this program, to decals, to clubs and other organizations here, and to entrepreneurship. And I think a lot of us are interested in entrepreneurship. Should we get involved in entrepreneurship when there's so much that we have going on in our short time here? And if so, how can we get involved without stretching ourselves too broad and too thin?
Yeah. Well, I think at some level, all of you should get involved, at least in taking the next step. Because it's too, people talk about the gig economy and so forth. It's like we are all entrepreneurs right now. You don't have to think about an entrepreneur as narrowly, I'm founding a new company and it looks like this. If you thought, what's the entrepreneurial mindset? How do I live my life in a more entrepreneurial way? I mean, to kind of stretch the metaphor, I'm a hack musician, but I love playing the guitar. And when I hear somebody say, she has a style, that's an artist that has heard something over the course of their life, of their artistic life. They've heard something fresh and they've said, that's fresh. And they've integrated a piece of that in what they do. And then a year later or whatever time, that's fresh, and they integrate. And you do that 5 or 10 times, pretty soon you've got a style. You are singular, and people want to hear that. So we all are managing our own human capital that way, de facto, whether you're an artist or not. And so I think the toolkit and mindset is going to be valuable for you, even if you know you never want to found a company. I think it's the right way to think about your life. And so the very first steps, there's something called Begin at Berkeley. I don't know if you've seen that website. Go to the website Begin at Berkeley. It's basically just sort of like, it's just so overwhelming. Where do I start? We created, wasn't me, others created Begin at Berkeley like 2 years ago. It's not, and it's a website that says, are you this kind of person? Here's how you can navigate this website and figure out some resources for you. Okay, so it's like got this concierge property built into it. Here's how you navigate because everybody's overwhelmed by Berkeley's ecosystem. It's just enormous, right? So I would start there. There's also something called STEP at Berkeley, STEP, that was started by some business students, and that's a really student-focused thing. It's like very far upstream. How do I start forming teams at the very earliest stages? So there are a number of slice-in points that you should have a look at. And for some of you, it will be like, all right, there are too many other opportunities. I'm not going to go down that path any further. I'm not saying you should go all the way down the path. But please think of that entrepreneurial mindset as something it will serve you forever.
Okay, we're close to out of time. We started off with what advice do you have for them? And I guess, after your 24 years of being faculty, do you have any other kind of parting words for them that, you've seen so many students come and go that, the students that have made the biggest impact here at Berkeley and beyond, what advice would you have for them? What should they try and do during their time here?
Yeah. Well,
expanding on the entrepreneurial mindset, as a whole.
So I think, I talked a little bit about Goldman as being a really tough time for me in the sense I just didn't know whether I was going to survive it, sort of succeed well enough to be able to stay there. And just the pace of learning, which was like multiples of, per unit time, multiples of what I'd been feeling in the prior years. And this is, people say get out of your comfort zone, but there's certain things where, this is a pretty safe environment at the end of the day, right? This is a pretty safe environment for you to do some experimentation. So I think if you pull yourself out of your kind of natural operating zone, mix with people you don't normally mix with, try and connect, reach out. It's sort of like, I think that's the essence of it. I'll give you a small example. I think once you exercise this muscle, you just get better at it. I mentioned, I'll close on this. I mentioned I'm a recreational or hack musician, and I'm really, that's all I am. But I really enjoy it. And I realized, what would be really hard for me is to go down to the Berkeley Farmers Market and busk, open up my guitar case, play songs, basically ask people to put money in my case. Now, what's the risk of doing that? It's zero. This is a psychological risk. This is not a practical risk. Every third or fourth Saturday, I'm down there playing at the farmer's market now. And I enjoy it now. But the first couple times I did it, it was really hard. When you do things like that are hard, but they're just on the face of it hard, they're not really risky. You get better at doing hard things. Tim Draper, a venture capitalist, some of you may know his name, he said before they bring people into their accelerator, they ask them to go out, like for males, this was the example he used, but he said, I want to know that you can go out on the street corner, right out there, and sell a stranger, or try to sell a stranger, feminine hygiene products. Can you do that? And it's sort of like, that would be hard for me. It's like, look, it's the same kind of thing. You've got to get psychologically through things that are hard, that aren't really very risky. Some things are risky. You make a mistake doing certain things, you could really set yourself back. I was not going to set myself back by playing poorly at the farmer's market. Not substantially. Anyway, so look for stuff that's out of your comfort zone, but not really very risky. That will strengthen you.
Very good. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
Let's give a big hand.
Thank you. Thanks.
Very good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Like I said, when I get 100 million, you will get
I love it.
Okay.
I love it. We'll build that curriculum together.
Okay.
If you have ideas on that curriculum, send them my way.
Okay. All right, everybody. If Rich has a little bit of time, if you want to